Next time you're mixing drums, try to hold off on using EQ for as long as possible. I've been trying this out on my recent productions and I've been super happy with the results. For some reason, when I reach for EQ too soon, I find myself chasing my tail with the drum mix. I cut out some highs that are bothering me at one point or some low ends that seem too overpowering at another, and down the line I have to compensate for those decisions later. I'm trying to get back things that I cut away, and I've got tons of plugins on every drum, way too many plugins on my drum bus, and drums that I'm not even happy with. But I found if I hold off on reaching for EQ, it forces me to make some other decisions first. I'll start off with just the levels, grouping all my drums together, deciding how loud should the overheads be. Do I want these room mics in my mix? Where do I want the kick? Where do I want the snare in relationship to one another? Just adjusting levels before doing anything else. After that, I'll reach for compressors. It's pretty common for me to compress at least the kick and the snare, sometimes toms, sometimes overheads, depends on the genre and the song. Once I have levels set, once I have some basic compression on the individual mics set, instead of reaching for EQ to fix anything that's still bothering me, at this point I will reach for sidechain techniques. And I'll sidechain the snare to the overheads, for example. If there's something happening in the overheads when the snare hits that's too harsh, I'll sidechain the snare mic to the overheads using like a multi-band compressor or dynamic EQ, so that that frequency cuts away in the overheads when the snare drum hits. I'm getting more of the snare tone from that direct snare mic and less of it in the overheads, but only when the snare is hitting. That way I'm not corrupting the rest of my overhead sounds for the rest of the mix. I'll do the same thing with kicks. If the room's got too much low end information whenever the kicks hit, I'll sidechain the kick drum to the room mics, but only rolling off the lows of the rooms when the kick hits. I don't want all of the room mic to duck every time the kick hits, just the low end. It's a more transparent move, and it allows for us to have fullness in the room mics for the rest of the time when the kick isn't hitting. So once again, preventing us from chasing our tails, of cutting off too much lows or too much highs to solve one problem but causing another problem. At this point, I'm sometimes saturating kick and snare to get extra clarity. I like to use multi-band saturation as well, so I can saturate just the top end of my kick and just the top end of my snare. Getting that extra presence there without a big EQ boost tends to be less harsh, I guess, and more natural sounding to my ear. At this point, I'm going to the drum bus, adding compression, adding saturation to the whole drum kit. Whenever I'm working at the bus level, I reach for plugins that have a dry wet knob. I like to dial in maybe a little more aggressive saturation, a little bit more aggressive compression, and then dial it back so that there's not, dial it back so that there's only what's needed in the mix. It's still mostly the dry drums and just a little bit of that saturation, a little bit of that more heavy-handed compression at the bus level. Those kind of moves, once again, need to be made in context of listening to all the instruments and thinking about the genre and their desired impact. If you're mixing a jazz song, it's going to be way different than if you're mixing metal. Usually at this point, I still will reach for a little bit of EQ. If I've tried everything else, if I've worked my levels, compression, side chaining, compression and saturation at the bus level, and I'm still catching some things that are bothering me, then I will reach for a little bit of EQ and try to be as transparent as possible. Often starting with dynamic EQ if needed, so that I'm making a cut only in a certain frequency, only when that frequency hits, and the rest of the time leaving it untouched. Try it out the next time you're mixing drums. Hold off as long as possible on reaching for that EQ plug-in, and I think you'll find that your drums are fuller, more natural sounding, and causing less problems in the mix. Try it out, let me know how it works.